Welcome to TEC's Indigenous Cultural Awareness Training Program, better known as ICAT. This training is part of TEC's efforts to advance Indigenous relations and create a space of meaningful inclusion in the workplace. It is an introduction to North American Indigenous history, culture, and rights, with an emphasis on the Canadian context. Upon completion of this course, you will be able to begin to understand the history and diversity of Indigenous peoples, connect how history and colonization impacts the contemporary realities of Indigenous peoples, describe TEC's approach to working with Indigenous peoples, identify opportunities to continue your learning journey, and begin to think about ways to support reconciliation. TEC's ICAT covers sensitive content that may be uncomfortable, trigger memories of unsafe personal experiences, and challenge previously held beliefs. This is a core part of the learning process, where there is a combination of learning new information and unlearning misinformation. It is common for learners to feel emotions of sadness, anger, frustration, confusion, and many others. Feel free to take breaks as needed and use the available support document and ICAT toolkit. My name is Denise Halfyard, and I will be guiding you through this course. I am a Wet'suwet'en, Tsimshian, Gitxsan woman from northern BC. I am a voice actor, an advocate for our missing and murdered loved ones, and have a passion for creatively amplifying Indigenous voices. I would also like to introduce Holly Fortier, a Cree and Dene woman from Fort McKay First Nation, Alberta, who was born in Treaty 7 territory, and Chief Dr. Robert Joseph, founder and ambassador of Reconciliation Canada. You will hear from Holly and Chief Joseph throughout this training.
Hi, I'm Jonathan Price, and welcome to TEC's Indigenous Cultural Awareness Training. At TEC, our purpose is to provide the essential resources the world is counting on to make life better, while caring for the people, communities, and land that we love. Nearly all our operations are either on or adjacent to Indigenous territories, and so we have a responsibility to build respectful and mutually beneficial relationships with Indigenous peoples. Part of being respectful is taking the time to learn about the history, traditions, worldviews, and rights of Indigenous peoples, which is foundational to our journey of reconciliation and creating strong, lasting partnerships. Indigenous peoples have been stewards of the land for thousands of years, and there is much we can learn from each other. But to do so, we must first understand each other. So thank you for taking the time to complete this important training. Beyond this program, I strongly encourage you to continue to look for more opportunities to expand your knowledge and learn how to build partnerships with Indigenous peoples. We all have a role to play in advancing reconciliation inside and outside of TEC, and I hope that this training will support all of us in that journey together. Thank you.
Language around Indigenous peoples is changing rapidly, so people can be nervous about unintentionally offending or making a mistake. This section reviews essential terms used when talking to and about Indigenous peoples. While this list is a starting point, it is best to ask Indigenous people how they would like to be referred to. Indigenous is an umbrella term for groups of people who have historical continuity with the land and have individual and collective rights, which include right to culture, language, ancestral lands, traditions, and self-determination, distinct social, economic, and/or political systems, distinct language, culture, and beliefs, and strong links to territories and surrounding natural resources. In Canada, there are 3 distinct groups of Indigenous peoples recognized under Canada's Constitution: First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. First Nations are Indigenous peoples in Canada who are neither Inuit nor Métis, and most but not all have reserve-based communities. Inuit refers to Indigenous inhabitants of the North American Arctic, Alaska, and Greenland. A common cultural heritage and language unite them. Métis are Indigenous peoples who emerged out of the relations of First Nations and Europeans from specific early settlements such as the Red River in Manitoba. Métis peoples have a distinct identity, culture, and consciousness. Aboriginal is also a general term that refers to First Nation, Inuit, and Métis people in Canada. This term has now become outdated and has largely been replaced by Indigenous. The term Indian is also outdated and offensive. It was first used by Christopher Columbus, who mistakenly thought he had reached the East Indies. Due to the colonial roots of this term, do not use it when referring to Indigenous peoples. There may be some exceptions when the term is used in legal matters or in formal titles, such as the Indian Act, or in a community name, such as a Soyuz Indian Band. In the U.S., American Indian, Native American, or Native are acceptable and often used interchangeably. However, these terms are not used in Canada. Before European contact in 1491, the Americas were home to around 60 million Indigenous people with sophisticated languages, cultures, governance, and economies. Colonialism is a policy to acquire full or partial political control over another country, occupying it with settlers, and exploiting it economically. Colonialism was supported by the Pope, issuing a doctrine of discovery in the 15th century that provided religious authority for Christian empires to invade and conquer non-Christian lands. Colonialism flourished between 1491 and the 1800s as Europeans inhabited the Americas, Africa, and most of Asia to gain access to resources such as gold, silver, furs, and fish. Canada's Indian Act was enacted in 1876 and is still in place today. It governs almost all aspects of Indigenous peoples' lives and was used by the Canadian government to assimilate First Nations people by outlawing cultural practices and traditional governance structures that had been in place for thousands of years. Holly Fortier will explain more about the Indian Act.
In 1876, the Government of Canada implemented the Indian Act. It was a piece of legislation that governed First Nations. So what they did is they said Indians, so I'm just going to refer to us again today as Indians, Indians and lands reserved for Indians are a federal responsibility. So they created the Canadian Indian Act. So first of all, who's Indian? So what they did is they assigned each Indian a number. Originally, those numbers were tattooed on us, but then they gave us cards with our numbers on it. I'm a registered Indian. I have a number and I'm registered through Fort McKay First Nation. So we're still registered today. We're the only ethnicity in the whole nation of Canada that are registered, that have a ministry, that have a department at a federal level for our ethnicity. Indigenous and Northern Development Canada. So what they did is they registered us. And then there was some rules within that. For example, one of the rules was if you're an Indian and you want to go to university, Indians were forbidden to register and attend post-secondary education. So then you became what's called non-status. So you went from a status Indian to a non-status Indian. Another rule was if you fought with the Canadian military while overseas defending our country, you lost your status. You became non-status. And that story went further because if you came back, another rule was that Indians could not go into a place that served alcohol. Well, Royal Canadian Legion served alcohol, and that's where veterans found fellowship and assistance after the war. So one of Canada's most highly decorated war veterans, his name was Tommy Prince. He died alone in a Manitoba hotel room. So whenever we have celebrations and there's veterans there, we always honor them first because they protected us, they fought for us, and we honor them. Another rule under the Canadian Indian Act was that If you're an Indian woman and you married a non-status man, you lost your status. You became non-status. Now the reverse was true. If a status Indian man married a non-status woman, she is now a status Indian, despite her ethnicity. And another rule was that Indians could not buy or sell. What is business? What is agriculture? That really prevented us from that entrepreneurship that we are so capable of.
For over 150 years, First Nations, Inuit, and Métis children were taken from families and communities and placed in government or church-run schools, often far from their homes. The stated intent was to separate children from their families and their culture, eradicate Indigenous languages, and assimilate Indigenous peoples so they no longer existed as distinct peoples. The last residential school didn't close until 1996 in Saskatchewan.
We call them survivors because of all the children that were apprehended from their homes and taken to Indian residential school. They never made it back. They didn't survive, 50% of them. And if you made it out, 90% of Indian residential school survivors ended up with a mental illness, depression, anxiety, addictions to more severe forms. And so they interviewed the survivors and they compiled 94 calls to action. And I'm proud to announce that the Government of Canada, under our new leadership, has said, we will honor those. This is where we are today in reconciling what happened with Canada, because this went on for far too long with our children. And we are all impacted by the ripple effect of this cultural genocide. And I'm not sensationalizing it by calling it a cultural genocide. The Chief Justice, Beverly McLaughlin, has addressed it as cultural genocide that happened in Canada. The UN has called it an ethnocide. And the last Indian residential school in Canada closed in 1996. It went on for far too long with our children.
Colonization has created lasting impacts, including economic disadvantages, inadequate infrastructure investments, and worse health. When it comes to infrastructure, Indigenous needs are often not recognized. In Canada, 44% of First Nations on reserve live in dwellings that need major repairs, compared to only 6% of non-Indigenous peoples. Many communities still do not have water treatment plants or proper sanitation systems, even though access to water is a fundamental human right. Further, when it comes to ownership of ancestral lands, governments only recognize a fraction of lands occupied by Indigenous peoples as legally belonging to them, even though in Canada, ownership of land is key to building wealth. Intergenerational trauma is a result of historical oppression passed down through generations due to the lack of culturally safe healthcare services and facilities, intergenerational trauma, and other factors. Indigenous peoples suffer from poorer health. For example, in 2018, the suicide rate among Indigenous youth aged 15 to 24 is 5 to 6 times the rate seen in the general Canadian population. Colonialism also imposed patriarchal attitudes on traditional societies where men and women held balanced roles. 61% of Canadian Indigenous women will experience some form of intimate partner violence after they turn 15. Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls, MMIWG2S+, is a grassroots movement that aims to bring awareness and create change around the epidemic of violence faced by Indigenous women, girls, and gender-diverse people. Indigenous history and voices have historically been kept out of our mainstream media, school curriculum, and arts and culture. When Indigenous representation is missing from these spaces, it leaves room for stereotypes and myths to fill the gaps. Holly Fortier debunks some common myths and stereotypes in this next video.
So many people say to me, you're like a Saudi Arabian oil princess. Your First Nation is in the center of all the oil sands. And this is a really big myth in Canada, that we have a lot of handouts, that we are taking taxpayer dollars. I hear it over and over again about the handouts. And as a First Nation woman, I am just wondering about that, where those come from, because let's dispel some myths here. We don't get handouts. In Canada, there's a process called the Health and Social Transfer. This is where the federal government gives each province money for infrastructure. This is where education and health services gets their money. But First Nations get it through a different process. It goes from the federal government to Indigenous and Northern Development Canada, and then to the First Nations. So by the time we get it, the difference is about 52%. So what that would look like is a First Nation may have a medical clinic, but for their operational costs, for their staff, for all their supplies, they would get 52% than what a local town or city would get for the same services. Or for schools, our schools get 52% funding for the operational costs for their teachers, their staff, for their building, than what a local town or city would get. So the reality is, most First Nations don't have high schools. And our kids actually have to leave home to finish high school. So that's the reality, is that we do not get a lot of handouts. We actually get less money than the rest of Canada. And there is money for post-secondary education, and this is a very small piece of the pie for federal funding. But I always say, let's not be resentful of this, because I always say education is the new buffalo. We need our kids to finish their education, to go to post-secondary, to get their diplomas, their degrees, to become masters, to get their PhDs, to move on in their education. This is very important, because in order for us to be part of mainstream Canada, to live in two worlds, the elders always say, let's remember our traditional ways, but let's go learn the new ways so that we can have one foot in both worlds. So this is really important. Another big myth is that we don't pay taxes. Now, I'm a First Nation woman. I have a company that is First Nation, and I have a home and a vehicle, and I make purchases. As a matter of fact, I have an accountant to manage all that, and I pay taxes. The reality is, there are some exemptions for tax-free, that, for example, if you are First Nation, you live on a First Nation, you work on a First Nation, then you can be tax exempt. But the reality is, most First Nations don't have jobs. And only 50% of First Nation people live on First Nation. So the majority of us that are working off First Nation, therefore we are paying taxes. So racism sets in when there's a perceived notion that someone has an unfair advantage. And so let's dispel the myths. The reality is that there are 632 First Nations in Canada. About 600 of them are in third world conditions. Poverty is our biggest issue. It's not that we get all this money for free. And anywhere we have poverty on the globe, you have a direct link to corruption. So that's the reality in our communities, is that we're really dealing with poverty. And it's really easy for you and I in our privileged situation to go, well, get a job. go to school, get out of your poverty situation. But if you study poverty around the globe with community development, you will see that poverty actually has a mentality, has a stranglehold on folks where they don't even feel the ability to go get a job, to leave home, to move forward. So we have to work through that, and poverty is a really big issue. So let's dispel the myths that Canada, First Nations get all this money, that we get all these handouts, because in reality we don't. Now we do get money, we do get our treaty payments that were promised in the treaties. The numbered treaties where I'm from, in Treaty 8 area, we get $5 per person per year. That's what we get. That's the handouts. So let's dispel the myths about that we get all these handouts, that we're living off taxpayer dollars, because we were really not.
In May 2021, to Kamloops to Secwepemc Chief Roseanne Casimir confirmed that the unmarked graves of 215 students at the Kamloops Indian Residential School were located. Residential school survivors have always shared their stories of physical, sexual, and emotional abuse while attending these schools. These findings validate these stories and the fear, trauma, anger, and need for healing present in their lives. Therefore, the term residential school survivor is used. In 2021, the Government of Canada established the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation to recognize the tragic legacy of residential schools, the missing children, the families left behind, and the survivors of these institutions. National Day for Truth and Reconciliation is aligned with Orange Shirt Day, an Indigenous-led grassroots campaign to bring awareness and build allyship for residential school survivors, their families, and communities. Colonization has changed virtually every aspect of Indigenous life and led to systemic inequalities that will take time to undo. But that work has already begun. Today, there are social movements, legal cases, and legislation that are elevating the rights of Indigenous peoples globally and leading to broader societal change. A key part of this movement is the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, otherwise referred to as UNDRIP, which is a human rights instrument setting out the basic rights of Indigenous peoples globally. Though not legally binding, UNDRIP is a framework that can inform a country's laws and practices. UNDRIP took 25 years to develop and bring forward for ratification, as many states had concerns about the right to self-determination and control over natural resources on Indigenous peoples' traditional lands. UNDRIP passed in 2007, with only 4 states voting against its adoption: Australia, New Zealand, the United States, and Canada, all countries with large Indigenous populations. Canada has since supported UNDRIP and is now incorporating its principles into federal and BC legislation so that Indigenous peoples can more fully participate in decision-making that impacts their rights. One of the central rights of UNDRIP is the right to free, prior, informed consent, where Indigenous peoples must be able to give or withhold consent to a project that may affect them or their territories. Consent refers to the collective decision made by Indigenous rights holders and reached through the customary decision-making process of the Indigenous community. Free consent is given without coercion and is a process that is self-directed by the community. Prior consent is sought in advance of any authorization or commencement of activities, not just when needs arise. Informed consent is based on information that is clear, accurate, objective, complete, and delivered in a culturally appropriate language and format. TEC commits to work to achieve and maintain FPIC from Indigenous peoples when proposing new or substantially modified projects. In Canada, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, or TRC, was established to investigate the residential school system and its impacts. After investigating residential school practices and hearing from survivors, the TRC issued 94 calls to action, which serve as a roadmap for Canada's reconciliation journey. Call to action number 92 is specifically addressed to corporate Canada, which includes TEC, and is as follows. We call upon the corporate sector in Canada to adopt the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples as a reconciliation framework and to apply its principles, norms, and standards to corporate policy and core operational activities involving Indigenous peoples and their lands and resources. More specifically, call to action number 92 emphasizes the need for meaningful consultation, respectful relationships, and obtaining free, prior, and informed consent, ensuring there is equitable access to jobs, training, and education opportunities in the corporate sector, and long-term sustainable benefits are gained from economic development projects, and training for managers and staff on the history of Indigenous peoples, including training in intercultural competency, conflict resolution, human rights, and anti-racism. The TRC defines reconciliation as the process of establishing and maintaining mutually respectful relationships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples, and is a process to remedy the harms done by colonization. Governments, businesses, and individuals can all play a role in reconciliation. Governments can work with Indigenous peoples to eliminate the legacy of inequality and implement the Truth and Reconciliation Commission calls to action. Businesses can facilitate access to procurement and employment opportunities and build respectful relationships that honor the concept of free, prior, and informed consent. Most importantly, individual people can advance reconciliation through everyday actions. These can include exploring books, podcasts, and movies by Indigenous peoples, trying Indigenous foods through local restaurants or discovering Indigenous tourism opportunities, celebrating National Indigenous Peoples Day, volunteering or donating to Indigenous organizations. Most of TEC's operations, exploration, and development projects and legacy sites are within or adjacent to Indigenous peoples' territories, so strong relationships with Indigenous communities, nations, organizations, and companies are core to our business. TEC's Indigenous Peoples Policy is publicly available and outlines our commitments to Indigenous peoples. The policy is implemented by our Indigenous relations teams at site and corporate offices. TEC has committed to reconciliation with Indigenous peoples and supports employees who want to contribute. Here are some examples of reconciliation in action at TEC. TEC acknowledges Indigenous days of recognition by bringing in speakers, creating value shares, providing Indigenous books, and facilitating discussion circles. In 2020, Red Dog initiated an accelerated leadership development program as part of NANA's and TEC's ongoing commitment to NANA shareholder leadership development. The program objective is to increase the number of shareholder employees in senior roles. The pilot program concluded successfully, with a 5.3% increase in shareholder employee promotions in 2020. HVC is working with Indigenous peoples to incorporate traditional knowledge into our reclamation programs. In June 2019, prescribed burns were conducted at reclamation sites at HVC to test the effectiveness of these methods on accelerating ecosystem recovery. As we reach the end of this training, let's take a moment to watch this video message by Chief Dr. Robert Joseph.
Greetings all my relatives at Tech Resources. Nimuyut, we are all one. This is the idea that I hope we can share today, that you are carrying, which is why you're watching this video to learn more about truth and reconciliation. National Day for Truth and Reconciliation is important to all Indigenous people in the country, including myself. Actually, it's profound because it is a day when we feel that our lived experiences, our colonial past, and the suffering that we all went through validates those experiences. And during this day, we can reflect on that, and we can reflect together with others on how we begin to move forward in reconciliation. So when I dream about a reconciled Canada, I dream about a day of peace and harmony between us, love and trust. I dream about equality and justice. I dream about our children walking together, hand in hand, playing with each other, being respectful. I dream about a reconciled Canada that should always have been, and that we can move past all of the mistakes we have made. I think it's really important for Tech and its employees, when they're determining how to support reconciliation, is to begin by endorsing reconciliation as a core value. And I just ask that you have faith and you keep doing that, and we're going to move forward incrementally, sometimes in small steps, sometimes in big steps. But what's important is that all of us are engaged in reconciliation. As you move forward from this day, and after having heard my talk, my little talk, I want you to think deeply about yourself and your family, and then think deeply about Indigenous people and how we can get along better together. But it really, really starts with you.
This course is an introduction to Indigenous history and culture. We encourage you to continue your learning journey and find ways to advance reconciliation inside and outside of the workplace. Thank you and congratulations.